Well, in terms of the Labour Party, I think it's important to put this in context. Support for Brexit had broad cross-party appeal. Labour voters, Conservative voters and naturally UKIP voters, and also a significant minority of Liberal voters as well. So this was cross-party. And if we look at the election this year, it was quite clear both major parties fought the general election on being outside the European Union, outside the single market and outside the customs union. But in a historical context, sovereignty is key to this issue. And if you want two of the best speeches on why the UK needs to be outside the EU, they're from Labour Party people. Hugh Gateskill, in 1962, at the Labour Party conference, probably gave the best speech on why Britain should not join the EU. It was about sovereignty. In 1975, I remember when I was a schoolboy, being so impressed listening to Peter Shaw give a really powerful speech about why the country should have voted then in that 75 referendum to leave the EU, again based on sovereignty. Labour clearly has some tactical issues, but really to achieve Labour's economic agenda, to reposition the UK economy, it has to be, in my view, outside the single market and outside the customs union. It's about basically having a policy that returns regional policy. As we outline in Clean Brexit, we've got 25 blueprint bullet points for the domestic economy, including, as we say, Labour's policy of boosting the infrastructure. We can return competency in so many areas that reinforce and help our domestic economic agenda. And do remember that the UK has been at the forefront of pushing workers' rights in the EU. These will be protected outside the EU because Parliament will be open and responsive to the will of the British people. So I think for the Labour Party, and indeed for the country, the best policy is to be outside the European Union. Where will the UK be in 10 years' time outside the single market? I think it will be in a very strong position. Clearly, as I said during the referendum, and as we outline in the book Clean Brexit, there's a sort of potential shock from leaving, in the sense you can't be in something for over 40 years and expect to leave it easily. But of course, that doesn't mean that the economy is going to go into recession or anything like that. It just means that we have to work even harder to make it a success. But in 10 years' time, the world economy is changing. The European Union is a smaller part of that global economy. The European Union is already a smaller part of our export market. We want to have a good relationship with the EU. But when you look at some of the big global trends, China's Belt Road Initiative, the fourth industrial revolution, it's quite clear that we as a country need to invest more, we need to innovate more, and we need to boost our infrastructure. We can only do what we really need to do and have to do, in my view, fully outside the EU. And once we're outside the EU, we can't blame Brussels for anything that goes wrong. We take responsibility ourselves and we'll sort those problems out ourselves. So I'm really positive about the issue and the outlook. Really it's about how we reposition ourselves in that changing, growing global economy, and we have much better chance and opportunity to do that outside the EU. So what would be the best migration policy for the UK? Well, let's put this in context. Migration is good for an economy, but unlimited migration is not good. Over the last 14 years, the UK has averaged each year an increase in net migration equivalent to a city the size of Newcastle. Migration is clearly far too high. We need to control it. Now, in the book, we argue to have migration into the UK, and we discuss a number of possible migration policies. There's a points-based system, which indeed Gordon Brown introduced for non-EU migrants back in 2008. That's used by Australia, but might not be ideal for the UK. There's also a work permit system where we basically try and attract skilled workers linked to the jobs they have. There could be an emergency brake, which probably wouldn't be allowed by the EU, as we remember. And then the most interesting possibility is to have a regional immigration policy, which is what maybe people in London are talking about. So there are different options there. But the real issue is this, that by actually addressing this, by talking about it, we recognise the challenges that migration has had in terms of different parts of the country, on public services, on schools, on suppressing wages. It also highlights the need for UK companies who have underinvested in UK staff to spend more on training their staff, particularly once they're in that occupation. We also need as a country to boost vocational skills linked to our whole education system. But the point at the end is that migration is good, but unlimited migration is not what we want. We want to have a sensible migration policy, and that's one of the issues we discuss within the book Clean Brexit. Is the eurozone crisis winding down? The answer is no. What we're seeing at the moment is a welcome pickup in the eurozone economies. I expected it, we outline it in the book, and it's partly a consequence of the improving outlook for the world economy, which is good for Britain as well, and also for the EU is a consequence of the European Central Bank printing money. But one of the issues we didn't discuss enough in the referendum campaign was the fundamental underlying flaws of the European Union. At the heart of the system is an unstable currency system, the euro. The euro is a fundamentally flawed concept driven more by politics than by economics. Greece is not the same as Germany. Spain is not the same as Germany. Therefore, for the euro to survive, the EU has to move towards an ever closer political union. That will create tensions, that will create problems. What we've seen in Catalonia is just an example of the expected problems in the future. At the same time, as we mentioned in the book, there are 435 million people in Africa under the age of 16. We want to see a strong African economy, but the EU needs to have a migration policy to accept the fact that there will be migrants both from Africa and from the Middle East into Western Europe. We need to have a sensible migration policy accepting refugees. But what we find within the European Union is that they run away from these issues. Bureaucrats in Brussels tend to set the agenda. So have we seen the last of the EU's and the Eurozone's crises? The answer is not. It still has problems. And at the end of the day, the UK, I think, is better off outside of the EU. And as we found before the referendum, the previous Prime Minister, David Cameron, was not able to get an opt-out for the non-Eurozone countries compared to the Eurozone countries. So Britain basically is better off trying to position itself globally outside of the EU.